In today's video, I'm going to discuss the construction techniques used in creating the collar on a tailored garment, specifically the undercollar. This is the top collar that runs into the lapel. This is what the audience sees. Underneath is the undercollar. There are many ways you can construct tailored garments. The undercollar specifically is one area where you can bring to bear your knowledge and experience and your personal artistic choices in the construction. For example, on this collar, or rather undercollar, this is a manufactured garment, and so you can see with the construction on this collar, there is a contrasting fabric. This is collar felt or collar wool. You can buy it in various colors, and it usually blends in with the color of the suit. And here you can see machine stitching and machine stitching here to finish off that edge. You can also see that the roll line, this is the roll line from the lapel up and around the back of the collar, has been machine stitched for stabilization. So this is one method of creating an undercollar. On this suit coat, similarly, the undercollar is cut of this felt with machine stitching on the roll line and machine zigzagging to finish that off. And they have extended the wool from the top collar and turned it around the corner and zigged it in place here, not through to the outside, but just to the undercollar wool. And that's very common. In fact, that's more of a traditional finish on an undercollar this way. You can see the zigzagging here. This is still a machine-made undercollar. Another choice for the undercollar material would be to make it out of self fabric. In case you didn't want that contrasting look. And you can see here, well, I hope you can see here, there are hand stitches here, there are hand stitches here, there's a felling stitch to finish that off, and then here, again, the top collar has been brought around, which creates a nice crisp corner, and then it's hand felled here. This is another construction choice. So to cut the layers for the undercollar, you'll start with your collar pattern, and it has the roll line here. The neck edge is the one with the notch on it, center back, and we cut the undercollar, all of the pieces, on the bias. You want to check to make sure that the stand part of the collar is a little shorter than the part that folds over and that we see on the outside of the coat. I've put contrasting paper there so that you can see. I like about 1/4 of an inch, maybe 3/16 of an inch longer on the collar fall than on the collar stand. That's so that over time the collar doesn't creep up and we don't see that collar neck seam. So we start with the collar pattern, and we would cut 2 out of whatever it is that you're going to cut the undercollar out of, either self fabric or that collar felt that I talked about before. Then there are a couple materials that you can use for the guts, the interfacing of the undercollar. You can use just Hymo, cutting the same amount of seam allowance, marking the roll line. You want to mark that shoulder notch, and this would be cut on the bias this way. If you're going to use this Hymo, it produces a softer collar, which might suit your show or your client. You would want to cut some collar canvas or pocketing or something to reinforce this area here on the collar. That's that collar notch, and you want that to be nicely crisp. Collar canvas comes on a bolt like this. It's very nice stiff stuff, and you can use that for the reinforcement. You can also cut that and have that be the interfacing itself for the collar. It produces a very crisp, sturdy collar, but I have seen Hymo used with some reinforcement or the collar canvas. Today I'm going to be demoing with collar canvas. As a teaching tool, I have students do an exercise where they cut the undercollar with one half of collar canvas and the other half of the Hymo, and construct a sample collar so that they can see what the difference is between using those two materials, so that they can have an educated hand and eye to make a choice in the future as to which they would prefer to use. Regardless of whether you use self-wool or the collar felt for your undercollar, you want to, again, cut that on the bias and then seam that together, trimming that seam down to 1/4 of an inch, pressing it flat. The same would happen on the felt. Seam that together at center back, trim that down to 1/4 of an inch, press that flat. That's so that on the outside we have that nice smooth seam at center back should the client or the actor want to flip up his collar. It's nice and smooth and clean finished. For the seaming at center back on the French collar canvas, you would cut it the same, but instead of a normal regular seam, plain seam, you would overlap the pieces matching center back, stitch that, trim that down. What that does is produces a very flat seam with no turning to create any bulk. So you want a lapped seam on your French collar canvas. Something that I do differently than other tailors is I cut this with a fair amount of seam allowance. That's because in educational theater I'm working with people who are tailoring for the first time, and having that little bit of seam allowance there helps ease us past any mistakes or oddities in the making up of it. We can always trim it down at a later step. It's much harder to reweave on fabric. If you make a mistake and you don't have the seam allowance as backup, you just have to cut another collar and start over again. In theatrical tailoring, as well as manufacturing tailoring, there are choices that one can make about how to construct the collar, and I'll show you two samples here. This is a sample of a traditionally pad-stitched by hand undercollar. You can see that the stitches go up and down on the collar stand, and then they run the length of the collar on the collar fall, if you will, the part that the audience sees on the outside. There's a line of small hand basting along the roll line itself, and that stabilizes the roll line. So this is traditional hand pad stitching in the undercollar to create the collar effect. This is a machine stitched pad stitching collar. On the stand, the stitch lines go side to side. This has been roll pinned and in its making up so that it's created that shape. And then on the outside, or rather the collar fall, it's been machine zigzag to quilt or pad stitch that together as well. You'll see this method on manufactured suits as well as suits that we make up for theater. For this sample, I'm using French collar canvas and the wool felt for the undercollar, and I have seamed the wool, as I said before, trimmed it down, ironed that flat so it's nice and flat on the outside, and I have overlapped the French collar canvas and stitched down, back up, trimmed that down. Next, I have hand basted the two layers together along the roll line so that they will start hanging together as a unit. You can see here I have cut the French collar canvas with no seam allowance at the neck edge, but a 1/2 inch at the collar notch and the outer edge. That's just to give me a little wiggle room in the making up of the undercollar. And you can see that the French collar canvas is cut 1/8 of an inch shy inside of the collar felt. That's so that when we are finished making this up and are stitching it to the coat neck, we don't have the risk of the collar canvas sticking out. We don't want that at all. We want that collar felt to be what we see here. The next decision you need to make is whether you're going to tape the neckline, tape the roll line or not. I generally prefer to run some tailor's tape, or you can use twill tape, along that roll line, and this is why. Beginning at center back, the great taping of the roll line controversy. Do you run the tape centered? Do you run the tape to the stand side? Great controversy among tailors. I tend to run it to the inside of the roll line, because if you center it, it eats into and it raises the roll line. What we're wanting to do is stabilize just to the inside of that roll line so that the outer collar springs from this taped, stabilized area. Whatever you do, whatever choice you make to the inside of the line or centered on the line, whatever choice you make on your collar, you also need to make that same choice when you tape the roll line of your coat front, because this roll line runs into the roll line on your coat front, so it needs to be consistent. So taping, with this taping, pull the tape a little tight, maybe 1/8, maybe 3/16, and pin that in place. Essentially, can you see that there's tension on the tape and there's extra length on the undercollar? What that does is creates a bit of an easing, and I do the divide and conquer pinning. So I've pinned the center back and the outer edge, and then I'm going to divide that ease in the middle, divide and conquer that, pinning, divide and conquer that. And what that does is it draws in the roll line so that it hugs the neck and creates a little bit of a spring for the collar fall to spring from that. I like taping the neck, the roll line, because our suits, when we build them for theater, and especially in educational theater, we use them. We'll use this suit for the next 15 to 20 years. And the taping, stabilizing of the roll line keeps that roll line stable for while it's hanging in stock, while it's being worn on stage. All of the abuse and use that our suits take benefits from this stabilization.